Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video on a channel called Engineering Made Easy, a channel which seems to have absolutely nothing to do with engineering, being full of videos like the spiritual meanings of waking up at 3 a.m. every night, and 9 strange things you will experience if your third eye is opening, among others. So, not really engineering, but at least we can learn from these video titles that this channel isn't likely to be a brand of fundamentalist Christian. Anyway, they also have a video titled 10 Scientific Proofs for the Existence of God, so I thought I'd see what they have.
Number 1. Similar geometrical patterns seen everywhere in the nature indicate a single creator, the God. If you look around you, you will find signature of God on different things, even on your body. Have you ever heard about golden ratio and Fibonacci sequence, which is present in many natural things? Actually, if any object is designed using golden ratio or Fibonacci sequence, its proportions and patterns are pleasing to the eye.
Okay, we'll get more into unpacking the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio in a moment, but the idea that these things are all pleasing to the eye deserves to be addressed on its own. But why do we find it beautiful? Well, it would be easy to say that we find it beautiful for the same reason we find other things beautiful. We evolved to find familiar things aesthetically pleasing. Familiar locations not only look better to us, but they feel better too. Think of that feeling of comfort and satisfaction that you get when, after a long road trip, you start to see landmarks that you pass all the time in your regular day-to-day life without even thinking about. Well, since the golden ratio is everywhere, again approximately, it stands to reason that it would be familiar to us, and so we would find it attractive. Hell, as you are likely about to point out, several parts of the human body match fairly closely with the golden ratio, and humanity wouldn't propagate very well if we hadn't evolved to find each other attractive. Though, again, this is approximate, and future me will be disagreeing with present me in just a few moments, so keep that in mind. But also, it's possible that there's another evolutionary mechanism going on here. We can process visual information that is presented in the golden ratio slightly faster than that which is not. This is likely due to the fact that the golden ratio shows up in a lot of organisms rather than inanimate objects. Again, at least approximately, and it is more important to process visual data that is associated with organisms than inanimate objects, so our brains evolved to process that information faster, and as an evolutionary side effect, this faster processing came along with a slight pleasurable sensation that we now recognize as appreciating beauty. I guess you could argue that God designed it to work that way, but that just seems like extra baggage if you ask me. The evolutionary explanations are perfectly satisfying all on their own. But also, this faster processing thing comes from one single paper that was published in a journal that I've never heard of before and can't find much information about, so take it with a grain of salt.
But what is this golden ratio and Fibonacci sequence, and where it is found in nature? Numerically, the golden ratio is represented as ratio 1 to 1.61.
Approximately. It's an irrational number, meaning that it continues on forever without repeating, and notably, it cannot be expressed as the ratio of two integers. That will be important in a moment. Phi, the Greek letter that's used to represent the irrational number on the right side of the ratio, is calculated as 1 plus the square root of 5 over 2. And with proper rounding, it would actually be 1.62, not 1.61, but I mean, it's not like we're going to be worrying about fitting it exactly for this argument, so who cares about a rounding error?
This ratio is also called as phi, also pronounced as phi.
Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of a bad argument. Oh, shut up. It's not any worse of a rhyme than the original rhyming fum with man. Whoever first said it that way was literally making up gibberish and still couldn't find a good rhyme somehow. And now, through years of tradition, I'm tied to that guy's original gibberish.
And here is the Fibonacci sequence: 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, and so on.
I don't think he ever explains this, so let me get this in for him. The way that translates into the golden ratio with the spiral is that, in this kind of spiral, the radius increases by the golden ratio every 90 degrees. But wait a sec, what's that got to do with the Fibonacci sequence, especially since all the numbers in the sequence are integers, and we already established that phi cannot be expressed as the ratio between two integers? Well, it's because the ratio between sequential numbers in the Fibonacci sequence, excluding the first few numbers, is always pretty close to phi, and it actually gets closer to it as the numbers get bigger, and mathematically this is quite fascinating, but it's got nothing to do with biology. Now, the ratios in the Fibonacci sequence never actually hit phi, because, integers, but it does get very close. So if you have a spiral that increases its radius in alignment with the Fibonacci sequence every 90 degrees, your spiral will be pretty close to a golden ratio spiral, but not exact.
Observe, in the Fibonacci sequence, each number is the sum of the two numbers that precede it. It's surprising to note that there are numerous examples in nature where we can find the presence of golden ratio and Fibonacci sequence. Like in many flowers, number of petals are one of the numbers present in the Fibonacci sequence. For example, buttercups have 5 petals, the chicory 21. The daisy contains 34 petals, and so on. Note that all these numbers are present in the Fibonacci sequence.
Okay, but what about all the flowers that have numbers of petals that aren't numbers that are also found in the Fibonacci sequence? Like lilies, which typically have 6 petals, or chrysanthemums, which typically have 16. Future Rhino cutting in. When I wrote that, I fell victim to the Google quick answer thing, where Google presents what it thinks is the accurate answer to your question right at the top of the page without you even having to leave Google. But then when I went looking for pictures of chrysanthemums, I noticed that they seem to have way the fuck more petals than 16, and I'm not going to bother counting them to find out whether or not how many it has is on the Fibonacci sequence, but it turns out that the 16-petaled chrysanthemum is the one found on a Japanese imperial crest, and even then, as it turns out, it's 2 layers of 16, so I still would have been wrong. So instead of the chrysanthemum, here's a 6-petaled gardenia to make this point with instead. Now, it does seem to be true that more flowers have petal numbers that fit on the Fibonacci sequence than not, and there is a reason for that, but it's not because a god exists. It's simply that evolution likes simple patterns, and the Fibonacci sequence is a simple pattern. Rather than having different genetic material required to build each individual petal, it just has genetic material instructing the building of a petal in accordance with a simple algorithm, and the algorithm that gets you the Fibonacci sequence is one of the simpler ones. It's evolutionary laziness more than design.
The Fibonacci sequence is also found on many fruits and vegetables like pine cones, pineapples, cauliflowers, etc.
Fun fact, the thing he's showing on screen while saying cauliflower is actually closely related but still different Romanesco broccoli. And while the total number of spirals on the head as a whole will be a Fibonacci number, the spiral itself is a logarithmic spiral that does not fit into the golden ratio. Such logarithmic spirals are common in nature because they are simple to make, both physically and genetically. All it takes is an instruction to grow, then turn a bit, and then grow again, and then repeat. Also worth mentioning is that having these growths, such as petals or leaves, staggered at irregular intervals will maximize exposure to the sun, and the easiest way for nature to accomplish the staggering is to make them grow at intervals that can be represented with irrational numbers, thus increasing our likelihood of winding up close to the golden ratio out of sheer evolutionary laziness, at least for plants. Increasing this likelihood is the fact that phi is actually one of the hardest irrational numbers to approximate with a fraction. And the more difficult it is to approximate with a fraction, the easier it is for evolution to make it, and the less likely that the resulting petals will block each other. So this then provides an evolutionary selection pressure toward growing petals with numbers that can be found on the Fibonacci sequence.
Golden ratio, that is 1 to 1.61, is found in various parts of the human body, like the ratio of the height of an adult to the height of their navel. Golden ratio also appears in the length of the forearm to that of the hand. On observing, you can easily find the golden ratio in your fingers, on your face, and many other places on the body.
I mean, again, you can find it, but approximately, not exactly. And notably, these measuring points are entirely arbitrary. Why measure from the belly button and not the hips? Simple, because that's the measurement that fits closest with the number you're trying to find. And notably, I've never seen anyone clarify whether we're measuring from the bottom, top, or center point of the belly button, and that will make a difference. There are also loads of ratios you can find on the body that don't fit with the golden ratio. This seems to be no more than an example of pattern seeking in a large dataset. And now might actually be a good time to clarify. Remember how I said the golden ratio spiral is one where the radius of the spiral increases proportionally to the golden ratio every 90 degrees? That's not technically correct. It's actually related to the golden rectangle. A golden rectangle being a rectangle where if you divide the rectangle into a square and a smaller rectangle, the smaller rectangle will also be a golden rectangle. The golden spiral is then formed by drawing a quarter circle in each of the squares, with the radius of the circle in each square being what I was referring to as the radius of the spiral. This approximates a logarithmic spiral, but it doesn't fit the equation for a logarithmic spiral. In reality, it's a sequence of circular arcs with sudden jumps in the curvature of the spiral in every segment, as opposed to a logarithmic spiral which has a gradual and smooth increase of the radius as the spiral goes. This is not the kind of spiral we see anywhere in nature. We see logarithmic ones because logarithmic spirals are easy for evolution to work with. It doesn't need to make a change to the underlying structure in order to continue growing, it just needs to keep growing. And also at this point, it's worth noting that the golden ratio's association with beauty is in doubt. This idea originated mainly in two sources. Luca Pacioli, I think I pronounced that right, who wrote a book called The Divine Proportion, which was indeed about the golden ratio, but did not make any argument about it being related to aesthetics, or any mention of it applying to art or architecture. Others will claim that Da Vinci heavily used the golden ratio in his work, most famously in The Vitruvian Man, but again, the measurements of this work are made in a rather arbitrary fashion, and the only time Da Vinci himself mentioned anything about using ratios in his work, he only ever mentioned ratios of whole numbers, which can't leave us with the golden ratio. There's really no other historical mention of this ratio that could tie it to art or architecture, aside from the same sort of pattern-seeking after-the-fact applications that rely on imprecise measurements from arbitrary points as the way you find phi on the human body. So, yeah, with this in mind, just ignore everything that I said earlier about why things with the golden ratio are aesthetically pleasing. Turns out they aren't inherently more or less aesthetically pleasing, it could just be that we only tend to look for golden ratios in things that we already find aesthetically pleasing, and since they can be found pretty much anywhere if we're willing to be arbitrary about where we start measuring, we find them everywhere, at least everywhere we look.
Not only this, it's present in our DNA. The DNA molecule for each full cycle of its double helix spiral is 21 angstroms wide and 34 angstroms long. Both of these numbers, 21 and 34, are present in the Fibonacci sequence.
I mean, sure, both of those numbers are present in the Fibonacci sequence, but when I looked up the measurements for DNA, I found that it was actually 20 angstroms wide, not 21, which suggests to me that you are fudging your numbers a bit to get to answers that you like.
And if we find the ratio of these numbers, we see the golden ratio, that is 1.61.
Well, if we divide 34 by 20 instead of 21, we get 1.7. So how much of a deviation is allowed before you'll stop claiming that it is the golden ratio? How precise does it have to be for it to still count? I mean, you're only off by 1 angstrom, that's not very big, right? Well, maybe not, but it amounts to just under a 5% difference in this case. So if we have a 5% wiggle room on either side of a measurement in order to make that measurement fit the golden ratio, you're going to find a lot of ratios that you can claim are golden but are really off by 5%. To put that into scales that are easier to picture, if we're doing the belly button to height ratio on me to find the golden ratio, that gives me a wiggle room of about 9 centimeters or 3.5 inches. That's massive! Also, for the record, I did do the belly button measurement thing for myself. If I measure to the bottom of the belly button, the ratio works out to 1.65. If I measure to the top, it's 1.63. And if I measure to the middle, it's 1.64. None of these are equal to phi, unless we're stopping at 2 significant digits, which seems short for a number that never ends. Are 2 significant digits close enough? Why? Why not 3 or 4 or more?
Number 2. Unbelievable complexity of the DNA code and the cell. I'm personally fascinated by this idea as I can understand how difficult it is to make the computer do any task by writing a code.
Alright, DNA is complicated, therefore it must be designed. Never mind that complexity emerges in natural systems all the damn time without intervention, and that DNA shows all the hallmarks of having emerged in just such a fashion, and that the hallmark of good design is actually simplicity, not complexity, so pointing out how needlessly complex everything is actually a decent argument against design. I spent too long on the first argument, so I'm just going to skip this one. If you want to hear me talk about it, this is similar to some of the arguments that we saw in my last 10 arguments video, so you can go and watch that if you haven't seen it already. But specifically, he brings up information in a little bit, so I will leave a link to a video I did a little while back that talks about just how wishy-washy you have to be with your definition of information in order for that argument to work in the first place.
Number 3. We see intelligent design of the creator in everything in the universe, whether it is living or non-living thing.
Well, I mean, that's more of the same pattern seeking that has us finding the golden ratio everywhere. Because if you look at nature without trying to impose design on it, you see a lot of things that are very obviously not designed, or were very poorly designed if they were. My favorite example of such bad design is the gene for synthesizing vitamin C. Humans have it, and yet we are incapable of synthesizing vitamin C because the version of the gene that we have was broken at some point in our evolutionary past, and at the time our ancestors got enough vitamin C from their diets to allow them to do without. But we still have the remnants of this gene just hanging out, doing nothing. Why would that gene be present if we were designed?
All the things in the nature are designed so beautifully that it becomes almost impossible to neglect an intelligent designer behind it.
Oh, was that not an argument from good design, but rather an argument from beauty? Okay, well, then I'd point you back to the beginning of the video where I talked about finding things that are familiar to us to be aesthetically pleasing for various reasons. For instance, kids are cute because you'd want to murder them too frequently if they weren't. Trust me, I know. Things that remind us of kids are also cute as a side effect. Things with big eyes, things that are small, things that are soft and fuzzy. And don't tell me that babies aren't soft and fuzzy. My kids were some of the fuzziest little critters you ever did see when they were born. As far as animals go, the more similar something is to us, the more likely we are to find it aesthetically pleasing. And as far as landscapes and stuff like that goes, there seems to be a balance between wanting to experience new things, seeing things like waterfalls for the first time are experiences that pack a bit of an extra oomph, for example, and being comfortable with the familiar. This gives us a drive to explore so that we can go and see these new things, but also makes sure that you know your way back to the safety of home. All of this is evolutionarily useful and does not require a designer to explain.
If someone argues that this beautiful design is mere a coincidence or made by chance, then I have a short story for him. Suppose you are walking along a beach and suddenly you found a wristwatch on the ground.
But what if it's an ugly wristwatch? You seem to be confusing the teleological argument with the argument from beauty here. Now, we all know the watch on the beach story. I'm going to go ahead and skip it. Moral of the story is, we know that watches are designed because we have experience with watches, and our experience universally agrees that they are designed. But this analogy kind of breaks down pretty quickly, because the idea here is that all of nature is designed. But then in this analogy, you're comparing the watch to other natural things in order to give a clear distinction between a designed object and an undesigned object. But if everything in nature is also clearly designed, then the analogy just flat out fails because there's nothing special about the watch. Everything is the result of an intelligent designer. The very act of using nature as the basis for comparison by which we determine that the watch is designed admits that nature does not have the appearance of design.
We also know that beautifully designed objects in nature have always been an inspiration for the designers and artists. Then how can we neglect the super designer who has been the great guru of all the human designers?
So, artists like to paint nature, therefore nature itself is the ultimate painting? I'm not sure I follow here.
Does he need more designs to make you believe in him?
No, it's definitely a quality over quantity thing. The design appears to be pretty bad, so throwing more bad designs at me isn't going to convince me that they're actually good designs.
If they are not designed by humans, then who has designed all these things? Isn't it enough to prove the existence of the supreme designer who has also designed us?
Nope, it most definitely is not. We haven't even gotten to a point where I'm willing to concede that anything was designed in the first place, much less quibble over who is doing this alleged designing.
Number 4. Similar designs found at the microscopic level of atoms and the planetary system is an indication of God's signature everywhere.
While it is true that the image of an atom that you're likely to see in a textbook does resemble a solar system, this similarity is oversimplified to the point of being incorrect. For one, the subatomic particles involved are not spheres. Electrons, for instance, are probably either clouds or strings, depending on which quantum model we're working with. For another, electrons do not orbit the nucleus in the same way that planets orbit the sun. If that actually happened, then every atom that has electrons would also have a magnetic field and give off electromagnetic radiation, because that's what happens when electrons move. Since that is not the case, we know that these electrons can't be just whipping around the nucleus like planets around a star. And then if we look at the solar system, the planets are actually rather arbitrary. That's why Pluto got reclassified as a dwarf planet a while back. We found a bunch more objects orbiting around the sun that, if Pluto is a planet, would fall into the same category and so would also be identified as planets. So rather than having to figure out names for potentially thousands of new planets and updating all of our little models of the solar system, Pluto got downgraded to make life easier. But this isn't like an atom where there is a nucleus and a set number of electrons, with the properties of the atom changing significantly if any of the constituent parts should experience a change. Did us removing Pluto as a planet make our solar system an ion, like removing an electron would? Or do we need to consider all the asteroids, meteors, comets, other Kuiper Belt objects, and what have you when we're making this comparison? Because there's nothing in an atom that is analogous to any of these other objects.
Number 5. Everything that exists must have a cause. Therefore, universe had a cause which was caused by an uncaused identity known as the God.
Here's the thing, though. This whole argument suffers from several problems. First, it makes the composition fallacy. Everything that we are aware of in the universe had a cause, but this causality does not necessarily extend to the universe as a whole. But then also, it's just not the case that everything that exists must have a cause, because we know of things like virtual particles and antiparticles that will spontaneously pop into existence out of nothing with no cause before annihilating with each other. And when talking about quantum mechanics, causality gets really wonky in a way that I'm not going to even pretend to fully understand. But to simplify it, in a chain of events that are causally linked, causation can flow in both directions simultaneously. A causes B, but at the same time, B causes A. And this has been experimentally measured. So everything in the universe must have a cause is a statement that cannot necessarily be extended to the universe as a whole, but also we know of things that exist within the universe that don't seem to require a cause, and also we know that the chain of causality is wonky at the quantum level. Then we jump from there to this cause must be an entity? Why? How do we know that it had to be an entity? We have enough information now to say that it's plausible that the universe did not have a cause in the first place, and yet you somehow are certain that the universe did have a cause and that this cause had to be an entity? And on top of all of that, you know that this entity must be the God, and ordinarily this is where I'd say that you have no way to justify the leap from a God to the Christian God, but I'm not certain what God this person is even advocating for. I think they might be Hindu based on their third eye video and their having referred to God as a guru earlier in this video, but those terms are not exclusive to Hinduism, so that is by no means a sure thing here. But whatever God it is, the leap from cause to specifically the God I believe in is going to be unjustified. But on top of all of that, with this phrasing of the argument, we're still left wondering what caused God. Because everything that exists must have a cause, God exists, so God must have a cause. So what caused God? Either we are left with an infinite regress, or we have to stop at a brute fact somewhere, something that just exists without a cause. I see no reason to take that brute fact all the way back to a god instead of just leaving it at the beginning state of the universe.
Actually, whatever begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist. Therefore, we can say that the universe had a cause.
The best part about this is when you put those two formulations of the argument side by side like that, it becomes very obvious that the begins to exist statement was meant to get around the special pleading that would be required to have God be the uncaused cause after we have determined that everything that exists has to have a cause. So now we know that not everything that exists has to have a cause, only things that begin to exist. Okay, why does that have to be God? Why can it not be energy, as predicted by the Hartle-Hawking model? And this also leaves us with a new problem. What does it mean to begin to exist? Have we ever actually seen something go through the process of beginning to exist? As far as I'm aware, virtual particles aside, we have never seen anything begin to exist in the sense of this argument. We've only ever seen matter and energy get reconstituted into other forms of matter and energy. So, how do we know what would be required for something to begin to exist in the sense of this argument? Especially since the only things we've ever observed that might count as beginning to exist in the sense of this argument actually seem to do so without a cause. So, with that in mind, the statement actually becomes everything that we know of that begins to exist does not have a cause. The argument doesn't quite work when you start with that premise.
Number 6. Delicate balance, connection, and interdependency that we see in the holy universe again is an indication of one supreme power.
I beg to differ. The delicate balance that we see in nature seems to be caused by cycles that run between times of plenty and times of suffering and starvation. In times of plenty, organisms reproduce to a point where the plenty will be all used up, and then their population will starve itself back down to normal levels. This isn't some delicate balance that can be upset at the drop of a hat. This is a balance that is constantly upset and is reset through pain, suffering, death, extinction, disease, and more.
If we look at the nature, we see that we all are connected. Even the non living things have deep connections with the living things.
It depends what you mean by connections, I suppose. My ass has a pretty deep connection to my chair right now, after all.
We cannot survive without each other. We need other humans, animals, insects, microorganisms, trees, and many non living things for our mutual survival.
Okay, so in order to survive, we need things that are available to us on the planet on which we evolved to survive. Therefore, God? Is that what I'm getting here? Because that's just straight up Douglas Adams' puddle analogy, where the puddle is so amazed that the hole it finds itself in is perfectly shaped for it. Yeah, we evolved to make use of the resources and environments that exist on the planet that we evolved on. Why would you expect otherwise? Also, you know that list that he just read that went on way longer than was necessary? Yeah, I've already skipped a couple of those that were even longer than that one, and I'm about to skip another one.
The Creator has made us in such a way that we are incomplete or cannot survive without each other.
Or, we evolved as a social species because there are certain survival advantages to working together.
It shows there must be a sensitive, logical, and super intelligent mind behind it.
If us working together shows that it has to be sensitive, then what does that say about the organisms that exist in such a way that their entire life cycle only causes pain and suffering for other organisms, like some species of wasp? Seems like a sensitive creator could figure out a way to fill the wasp's ecological niche without making it necessary to essentially torture its prey by laying its eggs inside it while it's still alive and then having the larvae eat their way out of this still living organism. Or how about the other organisms that are solitary and will chase away other members of their own species, often killing them in the process, and frequently in these same organisms engaging in the cannibalism of their own young? Would a sensitive creator design a system like that?
Who delivered a message of love, connection, and interdependency in his creation.
You really have to cherry pick creation to get a message of love from it. Most of it will be perfectly happy to kill you, often quite painfully. In order for humans to be safe, we literally had to subdue nature and make sure that it mostly stays out of the areas that we live in, except for certain specific highly curated and cultivated areas.
Number 7. Fine-tuned universe and extremely precise nature's physical constants point to a super intelligent creator.
You know, this whole fine-tuning argument strikes me as being incredibly arrogant. We look at this massive universe containing who even knows what, and just assume that the whole thing was made specifically with us in mind? Let's say hypothetically that there is a god. Why would we think, from looking at the universe, that this god designed the universe for us specifically? Why could there not be some other aspect of the universe that is only possible with this particular tuning that this god actually wanted, with life just being a side effect of this tuning for something else? Maybe God really likes black holes. There are a lot more black holes than humans, and the universe is pretty good at producing them. Maybe God likes stars. There are way more stars than people. Maybe God likes pretty swirling clouds, and the fact that life sometimes develops to also see pretty swirling clouds is just a side effect. There is so much that we don't even know about the universe that God could have designed it for. But no, it had to be us. We are obviously what the entire universe was made to contain. Couldn't possibly be anything else. What a self-centered, narcissistic, arrogant view.
Fine tuning refers to extremely precise value of nature's physical constants. Scientists have calculated that our universe would not have existed even if there were small changes in the values of the physical constants.
And that's not entirely true. It's more that the universe would not exist in its current form if these constants were changed, which is a bit of a well-duh kind of thing. If things were different, then things would be different. But as it turns out, there's quite a bit more wiggle room with these constants than apologists generally like to acknowledge. There are several potential configurations that the universe could have had, which would still allow for the existence of life. Regular viewers of my channel will probably be familiar with this graph, which shows potential values for the strength of electromagnetism and the strength of gravitation that would allow for life based on different parameters. Any spot below the black line would allow for stars that undergo nuclear fusion to exist. Any spot below the red line will have stars that exist long enough for complex life to evolve. Any spot to the left of the blue line will have stars that are hot enough to support biospheres. And any spot to the right of the cyan line will have stars that do not outgrow their host galaxies. The fairly large area in the middle of the graph is all the area where all of these parameters would allow for the development of complex life. The asterisk is where the values of those constants actually fall. Similar graphs can be drawn for all of the constants, this is just two of them, and as a nice little bonus, it's entirely possible that the constants are not actually fundamental. That is, there may be an underlying constant from which all the other ones are derived, meaning that a change to one constant will necessarily mean a change to the other constants, which then leaves us with far fewer constants that need to be precisely tweaked in order to allow for life. If they are all derivative of one fundamental constant, or if one of the ones that we already know about is the fundamental constant from which the others are derived, then that really takes the oomph out of this "there are hundreds of constants that all need to be finely tuned in order for life to exist" argument.
The whole universe acts as a very big machine, subdivided into infinite number of smaller machines, which proves that there must be a single mind behind it.
Nope. A machine has a specific purpose for which it was built, and toward which end all the parts work together. If the universe were indeed a machine, then it seems to be a machine that is designed to make a bunch of black holes. That is the thing that the universe does the most efficiently. I'm actually going to skip the rest of this one. This video is getting long, and he never actually explains what task this universal machine was designed for. It just seems to be an argument from everything operates in accordance with the laws of physics. Basically fine-tuning, but presented with less clarity as to what was even finely tuned in the first place.
Number 9. Non-physical aspects to human consciousness lead to indirect evidence of God.
So the mind exists, we have experiences, and well, all evidence points to our consciousness being rooted in the physical form and function of the brain. We still don't have the whole thing worked out yet, therefore God. Skip! Well, mostly skip. I do just want to play this part.
But the experience of consciousness is completely non-physical, which is still a mystery.
Okay, just one question for you. If the experience of consciousness is indeed still a mystery, then how can you say that we know enough about it to say conclusively that it is non-physical in nature? Seems to me that if it's a mystery, then at worst you could say that we do not know whether or not it has a basis in the physical, but again, all evidence points to it being based in the physical, as consciousness can be altered using nothing but physical means.
Number 10. There must be a supreme power or supreme intelligence that controls and guides all the objects to their final purpose. On observing the universe, you can find that all the things are ordered towards a purpose, whether they are living or non-living.
Can you tell me what this purpose is? Because it seems to me that stuff just behaves in accordance with the laws of physics without any apparent intentionality.
It appears that they all are guided by some superintelligence, which is pushing and moving them towards an end or some goal.
What end goal, though? If you can't even say what the end goal is, then this argument ends up being just complete post hoc bullshit.
Things do not seem to move randomly.
No, they don't, because the laws of physics are a thing that exists. Okay, if this is all there is to the argument, then I'm just done with this video. Let me just watch ahead quickly. Yep, that's it. Stuff behaves in accordance with the laws of physics, therefore God. I mean, he gets into biology and says things like the digestive system works without you even thinking about it, and some other ridiculous stuff like that, but when push comes to shove, that does all come back to things behaving in accordance with the laws of physics. So that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Blue Warrior, who says, "Repent and accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Euphrates River is drying up. The four angles will slaughter half of humanity." 3 things. First, obviously he meant angels, not angles. I don't think angles are gonna slaughter half of humanity all by themselves. Second, it's not half, it's a third. Read your own damn book, Revelation 9:15. And third, if your guy is the one who's gonna release his agents to indiscriminately slaughter a third of the entire world's population, then your guy is the bad guy. Thanks for watching, thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Ingrid Carlton and all the rest, who are the 1 plus the square root of 5 to the 2 that is my channel. If you'd like to be irrational and golden, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time.